Today's lesson is about pine cones. Before we go into pine cones, we must first learn about pine trees from which they grow. Pine trees are evergreen coniferous trees and are native to most countries in the northern hemisphere. Evergreen trees are known to have long lifespans, anywhere from 100 to 1,000 years. Some pine trees live longer than that. The oldest living pine tree is estimated to be 4,800 years old. The tree is called Methuselah, and it can be found in the White Mountains of California. Pine trees are edible, and various cultures eat parts of the pine tree, most popularly pine nuts. Additionally, you can eat the soft, moist, white inner bark of pine trees, which is called cambium. Adirondack Indians got their name from a Mohawk Indian word meaning tree eaters. Moving on to the basics of pine cones. Pine cones are the reproductive features of pine trees. Pine trees are part of a group of trees called gymnosperms, which have naked seeds, meaning they do not bear fruits or flowers to contain their seeds. Thus results in the purpose of the pine cone, which is to produce these seeds within it. Pine cones close up to protect the seeds from cold temperatures and wet weather. This is to ensure that the seeds will be dispersed during dry weather and the distance traveled from the tree will be enhanced. Pine cones will open up in warm weather. In fact, the condition of a fallen pine cone is a crude indication of the moisture content of the forest floor. Closed cones mean the conditions are wet, while open cones indicate the conditions are dry. The state of fallen pine cones is used to evaluate a forest wildfire risk. The archetypal pine cone is characterized by woody scales and an ovoid and globular shape. Pine cone maturation takes 6 to 8 months from pollination in most Pinacea genera, but 12 months in cedars, and 18 to 24 months, rarely more, in most pines. Once a pine cone reaches sexual maturity, it grows separate male and female parts called strobili, or strobulus singular. Male strobili tend to be clustered in large numbers, and the females are more dispersed, growing either singularly or in small clusters. Upon the branch of pine trees itself, male strobili will grow at the base and females at the tip of the branch. Female pine cones in their early life start out as green, but as they mature, harden and turn into the pine cone we all know. The male strobulus grows pollen and releases it into the wind, where it lands on the female strobili of neighboring trees to grow new pine seeds. Female strobili usually grow on the higher branches of the pine and the male strobili on the lower. This distribution is to improve the chances of cross-fertilization, as pollen is unlikely to be blown vertically upward from the male strobili. Instead, the pollen drifts slowly upward in the wind, which carries the pollen from the lower branches of one tree to the higher branches of another. Once the pollen lands on the female strobulus, it sticks to a fluid within the pine cone structure called the micropyle. The micropyle fluids then evaporate and draw the pollen closer to the ovules in the pine cone, which stimulates the pollen grain to develop a pollen tube. Before the sperm from the pollen grain make it to the ovules, the female produces 4 cells called megaspores. Only one of these megaspores survives and develops into multicellular megagametophyte, then grows archegonia, which contains egg cells. The archegonia takes a year to develop after the pollen grain first lands on the female strobulus. The pollen tube can now reach the female egg cells to fertilize them. After fertilization, it can take 2 to 3 years before the pine seed embryos are developed. From then on, they can now be dispersed and grow into new pines. Now that you know all about the pine cone process and life cycle, here are a few more random facts about pine cones. A group of female strobili are called an inflorescence. Jack pine trees live in hot, dry environments and have adapted to release its seeds only in the event of a wildfire. 20 species of pine produce pine seeds big enough for humans to harvest and eat. Pine seed or pine nuts contain vitamins B1, K, magnesium, manganese, phosphorus, zinc, and protein. The pineal gland in the brain is named after the pine cones because of its shape. The pineal gland controls our body's perception of light, as well as our sleep and wake patterns. Christopher Columbus came up with the word pineapple after he found they resembled pine cones, calling them Pina de Indias, or pine of the Indies. Englishmen later tagged apple onto the end to indicate pineapples were a fruit. That concludes our lesson on pine cones. Thank you so much for listening.